Thank you very much, Paul. Question everything. Well, a brief question for this morning is, how is it that here in this richest country in the world, for all practical purposes, we have a shrinking middle class, and therefore the resultant feeling of injustice that I sense is growing in our culture to some, in the perceptive aspect, those who are very perceptive in our culture. This morning, we were fortunate to have one of the professors of sociology and political science from our University of Arizona to give us some insights into this. He studies very, very extensively the causes and the consequences of such things as living standards, poverty, inequality, mobility, employment, economic growth, social policy, taxes, public opinion, and politics. He has written a book recently titled Social Democratic America, and that is the title of his speech this morning. So we're very fortunate to have with us the professor from the University of Arizona, Kenworthy. Welcome to the
It's okay. I don't actually need the screen. There's just a photo of the cover of my book. But you know the title. The cover's kind of nice looking, but it's not that big a deal. And I'm not going to show you a bunch of.
There it is. Microphone.
So this is not on.
Yes, it's good.
Closer. Oh, closer. Right. Yes. Sorry. Thanks. So I actually teach a lot of big classes at the university, but I'm used to having one of these little things you clip on, so I don't have to worry about keeping this close to my mouth. If I let it slide, just tell me. Okay, so this is one of these books that says, here's what I think is not quite right, or maybe very, very wrong with the United States. Here's what we could do about it, and can it actually happen? So there are three assessments and messages in the book, and I'm just going to summarize this for you, try to give you a feel for what I say. If you're interested, I mean, there's no way I can do justice to the complexity of either the argument or the evidence that I bring to bear on it, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. If you're really interested, I encourage you to get the book. You can actually get it as a Kindle book for less than $10, and the graphs, unlike a few years ago when Kindle was great if you just had text, books with text, but not so great with any kind of graphics. It's now very, very nice. And of course, you can read the thing on any kind of tablet device. But you can also buy the hard copy if you want. It's just more expensive. Okay, so the way I set out what I think is the core problem here, of course, the country and the world has lots and lots and lots of problems. I'm focusing on the socioeconomic sphere, in roughly the area that was just outlined here, or just mentioned, which is what I do my research on. And so I think that even prior to the economic crash that occurred in 2008, and from which we're only still very slowly recovering, we were doing pretty poorly in three very core areas of what we might call the socioeconomy or the political economy. Given that we're a very rich nation, we're no longer quite the richest country in the world using the standard measure, but we're passed by Norway, which has tons of oil, and Luxembourg, which is a banking city. So for all practical purposes, we are very close to being the richest country in the world, which means the richest country in the history of our species. And yet, we don't do, and again, even prior to the economy falling apart in 2008, weren't doing nearly as well as we should. First of all, on economic security, This is what fundamentally drove the New Deal political and policy reforms of the 1930s. It wasn't so much income inequality, which gets a lot of attention these days. It wasn't even poverty. It was economic insecurity. That's what Social Security, aid to dependent children, unemployment insurance, the measure which allowed union bargaining, all of these at their core had addressing the problem of economic insecurity as the main goal. Now, economic insecurity is not an easy thing to measure. One sort of commonly used measure these days has to do with, or looks at the share of people who experience a significant drop in income from year to year. So economic security is a pretty nebulous thing. We sort of feel like we know it when we see it. We think about people losing their jobs. But the way that social scientists have taken recently to trying to measure it is the share of households, actually, that experience a significant income drop from year to year. And we can use a very large threshold here, which is 50% of your income. So in other words, if you're making $50,000 one year and you go down to less than $25,000 the next year, we call that an income drop, or we classify you as economically insecure. Much more common indicator is a 25% drop. And this is very hard to measure, so it's not only difficult conceptually, but it's hard to measure because you need data on the same group of people over time. You can't just do what the Census Bureau does and what a lot of researchers do, which is take a representative sample of the population and ask them what their earnings or income was from the previous year. That gives us most of the data that we look at when we see statistics like median household income or income inequality. Most of those data come from this snapshot of households, but they're different households every year. So in any given year, they're a representative sample, but they're not the same households from year to year. And for this measure of economic insecurity, we need the same households from year to year in order to see whether their income's actually changing. So the best data that we have suggests that somewhere between 10 and 20% of American households in any given 2-year period will experience a significant income drop of 25% or more. That figure holds even when we exclude those who are retiring. So obviously we'd expect people who are employed one year and then retire the next year to experience a significant income drop. But even when you take them out, somewhere in the neighborhood, and it just depends on which data set you look at, between 10 and 20% experience this kind of drop. And that share appears to have been increasing over the last generation, since the 1970s. Not massively, but the sheer fact that it has increased, again, even before 2008 when the economy falls apart, is really, really discouraging in a very rich country. This is a problem that nobody really thought we had completely solved, but one where we were clearly making progress for a generation or two after the New Deal programs were put in place in the 1930s, and when the economy was growing at a relatively healthy pace, and that economic growth was fairly broadly distributed. We were almost certainly, we don't have very good data for the 1940s, 50s, or 60s, but we were almost certainly making progress in reducing economic insecurity. But we seem to have been doing, or we seem to have reversed course at some point in the 1970s. Another related measure of insecurity is the share of people who are vulnerable to a large unanticipated expense, and here health or medical expense is the main one. And the proxy that researchers often use these days is simply the share of people without, or the share of households without health insurance, which has now begun to go down as the 2010 Affordable Care Act has begun to be implemented. But according to the best data we have between the 1970s and 2010, it steadily increased, reaching up to about 15, 16, 17%, again, depending on the data source that you're looking at. And furthermore, that change hid a switch or a shift that was going on within our society. So the share of people who were getting health insurance through their employer or through other private health insurers has been declining, and the share getting health insurance through some type of government program, mainly it's Medicare and Medicaid, but we also have a related children's health insurance program. This was passed in 1998, which gives lots of kids access to Medicaid or some version of Medicaid. That has been increasing and taking up the slack. So the overall share without health insurance has been increasing, but the share without health insurance privately through an employer paying on their own has been increasing even more, again, until now. But it's projected that even when the 2010 Act goes fully into effect, we're still going to end up with 6, 7, 8% of Americans. This is the optimistic scenario without health insurance. So we'll have some way to go before achieving what every other rich country in the world achieves, which is virtually no one, no citizen at least, without health insurance. So economic insecurity, we're not doing as well as we should, and it looks like the problem's been getting worse. Same is true with equality of opportunity. Now, no one so equality of opportunity, long-standing, fundamental goal of our society, which almost everybody, regardless of where they are on the political spectrum, embraces. Nobody who thinks deeply or seriously about it thinks we actually could ever get to complete equality of opportunity. That is, the sort of rough way to think about this is every 21 or 22-year-old having exactly the same opportunity to thrive, let's say, in the labor market. And if you want to think of it more broadly, maybe in the family or work leisure dimension. But at least fundamentally in the labor market, there's no way we can do this because we know now that people differ genetically and that this has some effect. There's a lot of dispute still among social scientists about how much of an effect it has on people's capabilities. But much more importantly, we know that family circumstances and neighborhood circumstances are very different. And there's no way that any modern society, liberal society, if we think of liberal in the old traditional classic sense, which says that there have got to be some limits on how much and where government intervenes in our lives, no modern society is ever going to embrace government taking all kids out of households and putting them in sort of uniformly good or mediocre schools or childcare, so that family inequalities are completely wiped out and neighborhood inequalities are completely wiped out. Now, we can do a lot more than we currently do to try to reduce or alleviate the consequences of those types of inequality, but we're never going to have full equality of opportunity. What we want is as little as we can reasonably get, as little as we're fairly comfortable with. And while we've been making progress, we, the United States, have been making progress in reducing inequality of opportunity on two important dimensions: gender, first and foremost, where we made a lot of progress in the last generation, or even 2 generations. Race and ethnicity, secondly, where we've made less progress, but still non-trivial progress over the last half century or so. So that's a good story, but there's another dimension of inequality of opportunity, or cause of inequality of opportunity, where we're not doing very well. And here too, again, although it's tough to nail this down with existing data, it looks like we've been doing worse, again, even before 2008. That's inequality of opportunity stemming from what we might call, or at least what in the old days social scientists would call class background. And here I really just mean families and neighborhoods, and specifically income-related inequality of opportunity. So kids who grow up in low-income households now have even less of a chance to succeed in the labor market relative to kids who grow up in upper middle class and affluent households than they did back in the 1960s, 1970s. As best we can tell. There's some social scientists who dispute that, but nobody argues that we've made any progress here. That is to say that, like with gender and race and ethnicity, we've done better at reducing that inequality of opportunity. At best, it's been stagnant. It stayed the same as it was a generation ago. And much more likely, it's gotten worse for a whole slew of causes, which I'd be happy to talk or tell you about if you want me to elaborate. I'm just going to leave that there. The third problem, or the third area where we've been failing or not doing nearly well enough, is what I call shared prosperity, which in some respects is just another way of talking about income inequality. But I want to think of it here in a dynamic sense. So instead of saying, well, we have this much income inequality, let's say the top 1% of households have this share of the total income. It's in the neighborhood of 15 to 20% right now, depending on the measure you look at. But instead of saying that, I want to think about it over time. What we can say is that in the late 1940s, 50s, 60s, and through part of the 1970s, as our economy was growing, most households, regardless of where they were on the income ladder, were benefiting from that growth to roughly the same degree. In fact, as best we can tell, during that period, those who were lower on the ladder, the poor or working class, were actually benefiting percentage-wise a little more than those in the middle and the upper middle class. So income inequality was shrinking. But whether you think that was important or crucial, at the very least we can say that there was no broadening or no increase in income inequality. And those at the bottom and near the bottom were benefiting quite handsomely from the economic growth we had. Now, in the period since then, again, up to right before 2008, when the economy falls apart, we've had pretty substantial economic growth in the country. So say from 1979, which was a business cycle peak year, to 2007, which was another business cycle peak year, so it's kind of two comparable points to compare. The rate of economic growth was a little slower than it had been in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and through the early 70s, but not a lot slower. In fact, we actually grew, we, the United States, grew a little more rapidly than most other rich countries around the world. Not all, but than most. And that was a pretty striking accomplishment or achievement, especially since we started out already a bit ahead of most of these countries. Usually what we observe is some catch-up, so countries that start out poorer. If you look just at the set of rich countries around the world, which is about 20 or so, 20 to 25, depending on your definition, the countries that start out a little poorer are able to grow a little faster, and we actually, despite the fact that we started out higher, were able to grow as fast or faster than almost all of the other rich countries, and only a little more slowly than we had in that so-called golden age period after World War II. Despite that, though, incomes of households in the middle and below have grown very, very little. Again, here I'm not even taking into account what's happened in the last 5-6 years during this really, really bad economic patch. Almost all of that income growth has gone to those in the top half, and a really disproportionate share has gone to those at the very, very tip top. The top 5%, especially the top 1%, and even more so the top 0.1%, which is roughly speaking about 100,000 American households. So we have about 110, 120,000 households, 300 plus million people. If you talk about the top 0.1%, we're talking about 100,000. Still kind of a big group of people, but percentage-wise, that's a tiny fraction. It's 1 out of 1,000. They've gotten most of the income increase in the last generation. Very, very different from what occurred in the periods after World War II, where we had both good economic growth and shared economic growth. Since then, again, setting aside the last few years, we've had good economic growth, but it hasn't been broadly shared. And that's objectionable probably on moral grounds, but it's also a bad thing. Social scientists are learning more and more about consequences of stagnant incomes for households or people in a rich country over long periods of time. There's an economic historian, Benjamin Friedman at Harvard, who wrote a very nice book about 8, I think, years ago now, talking about how when incomes are stagnant in a context of a society where people are accustomed both to affluence and to an upward trajectory, they become less generous, they become less altruistic, they become less participatory in their communities and in the broader politics. So it's not just an issue of frustrated expectations or lack of fairness. There may be other consequences to the society when we experience these long periods of either slow or income growth or actual income stagnation, which has characterized the last generation, the last several decades. Okay, so we've got these problems, and again, they preceded the Great Recession. They've been accentuated by the Great Recession. What can we do about them? Well, there are literally hundreds of proposals for all kinds of policies or institutional changes or changes to markets and our broader economic system that are on the table. What I suggest in the book is that from our experience here in the United States over the last 80 years, since the 1930s or the early 1930s, and the experience of other rich, long-standing democratic nations around the world, and these are the ones that I think we can really learn from. There are 190 plus nations in the world, but most of them are so poor and have differently functioning political systems that it's not very likely that we can draw any inferences from their experiences for a country like the United States. But from the other rich, long-standing democratic nations, we can, although they're in some ways fundamentally different from us. It's relatively reasonable to think that we can learn from their experience, and we certainly can learn from our experience over the last 80 years or so, even though our society and our economy continues to change, and something that worked or didn't work in the 1950s doesn't necessarily have much applicability today. But this is the best evidence that we have, that social scientists have to draw on. And I think the fundamental lesson that we can learn from this experience, again, of our own country and the other 20 or so rich countries around the world, is that public insurance programs are very effective at dealing with these three political economic problems. So what do I mean by public insurance programs? What I mean is a government program that collects money from the population, usually through taxes, but there are a variety of ways to do this, and then spends it either for everyone or more commonly for those who fall into a certain risk class. So this is just a public or government way of doing what most private insurance types of programs do. Everybody pays in, Not everybody, depending on the particular risk or the particular program, not everybody, or in some cases everybody in a certain group, falls victim to the risk and therefore benefits. Other people don't benefit, but that's okay because they're only paying a small amount in. When everybody pays in, the amount that you have to pay in is spread fairly evenly over a very large group, and so the cost to any given person is relatively small. So it's affordable, it appears affordable, it provides a solution or at least a remedy for a variety of risks to people who suffer them or experience them. And in these ways, it can help address these problems of economic insecurity. It's fairly obvious how public insurance programs, even private insurance programs, do that, but also equality or inequality of opportunity and lack of shared prosperity. Let me give you an example for inequality of opportunity, just to make sure you understand. Here, the best example of a public insurance mechanism is public schooling. So prior to the mid to late 1800s, no country in the world had any public schools. People were educated within households mainly, if they were educated at all. They often learned on the job. There was no broader or general skilling. Then we created public schools to take this burden off of families and communities and individuals when they reached adulthood, to collectivize, if you will, and to safeguard against the risk that your parents didn't know enough to teach you very well, there was no one in the community, or you had trouble learning on your own, or there were no private schools that were of decent quality and affordable. These risks still exist. There are a lot of countries around the world where there's no very well-functioning public schooling system. They massively reduced inequality of opportunity in our society. They didn't get us anywhere near close to perfect equality of opportunity, or they didn't, that's to say they didn't do away with inequality of opportunity, but they did a lot to reduce inequality of opportunity that comes from different genetics, different family circumstances, different neighborhoods, different choices and preferences that people have and make. The same arguably would be true with early education. It was an arbitrary decision to start public schooling at the age of 6 or 7. So we now have in almost every rich country, or almost every country, in the world has a system that we think of as K through 12 schooling, and then we have a separate tertiary or post-secondary or university system. Not many countries in the world have a formalized early education system. We added on kindergarten differently in different states, and there's still plenty of states around the U.S. that only have half-day public kindergarten. Some states in the United States now have preschool for all 4-year-olds. It's universal. Others have partial 4-year-old systems. There are several countries, most notably Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and to a lesser extent Finland, that now have something akin to full universal K through 12 schooling that goes all the way down to age 1. So most families in these countries get a parental leave that's in the neighborhood of 12 to 13 months. So one or both parents can take 12 or 13 months after a child is born off. They get about 80% of their pay, so it's very affordable, but it's not so lucrative that there's a real enticement to have kid after kid after kid after kid. Not that anybody who's rationally calculating would want to do that anyway. In most families, as a parent, again in these countries, as a parent that stays home with the kid, occasionally 2 parents, for about 12 months. After that, most kids go into early education. This is what they call it. We would call it child care and then preschool, but they refer to it and think of it very much as early education. Not that kids are sitting down and learning math at age 16 months, but they're socialized and they're put in an environment where there's a lot of mixing of kids from different class or income backgrounds. There's emerging evidence. This is not a slam dunk case by any stretch, so there's a lot of contestation among social scientists. But there's emerging evidence that this, like the introduction of public K through 12 schooling before it, has the effect of massively reducing inequality of opportunity. Poor kids who grow up, or kids who grow up in poor families in these societies have a variety of advantages. Again, I'm talking about Denmark, Sweden, Norway, to a lesser extent Finland. But they tend to do much better on scores, on test scores, on staying in school, on going to and graduating from college, and then also in the labor market later on in their lives than comparable kids, and not only in an absolute sense, but relative to their peers or their counterparts from middle class, upper middle class, and affluent families in these countries. They tend to do a lot better than in societies like the United States and others. And this includes most of the rest of Europe, too, that don't have universal early education types of systems. So that's just one example. But the big point here is that we know from an accumulation of evidence that public insurance can help address these types of problems. Now, there are lots of other reasons why various people, again, depending on where you are on the political spectrum and what your views are about government effectiveness and how a modern society should work, there are lots of worries or objections that you might have. And I'd be happy to talk about lots of them. The longest chapter in this book is one where I try to walk readers through step by step about 15 or 20 of these objections and worries. So everything from, well, isn't this too expensive? We simply can't afford it, to won't it wreck the economy if government's taxing and spending too much, to others on the left that say, well, why don't we reinvigorate unions, or why don't we introduce a basic income grant, or why don't we move toward full-on profit-sharing types of programs. So again, there are lots and lots of alternative suggestions. I think the evidence tells us that public insurance programs, and again, there are lots of different programs here, and they're varied, both in their structure and in their in the sort of substantive type of risk that they aim to address. I think public insurance programs are, according to the evidence, probably our best bet. Now then the question obviously is, well, is there any reason to think that we might move in this direction? We're stuck in this political system which throws up lots of barriers to progressive policy advance. So here I'll refer to enhanced use of public insurance as progressive. I think that's probably going to offend anyone here or surprise anyone here. Not only that, but we've got a very weak labor movement. It's been getting steadily and systematically weaker over the last generation. We've got a so-called left party, which by comparative standards, by the standards of the rich world, is not really particularly left, although it has some left elements in it. We've got a political system which is very open to private money, and because of recent Supreme Court systems, has been getting more and more open to private money, at the same time that private money's been getting more and more concentrated, leaving a relatively small handful of people with an awful lot of money that in some cases they don't really know what to do with, and so some of them think, oh, maybe I'll buy a political candidate, or maybe I'll even buy a state. And when I say buy, I don't mean in a literal sense, but it's possible to try to do something like this given our political system. Furthermore, we've got changing electoral coalitions. So the sort of core group on which our left party, the Democratic Party, succeeded and thrived electorally in the period from the New Deal of the 1930s onward, that is, the white working class has slowly but steadily been shifting away from the Democrats over the last 50 years, and now tends to vote, depending on the particular election, about 2-to-1 for Republicans, and maybe continuing to move in that direction. So it could be that the Democrats, irrespective of the role of private money in our elections, it could be that the Democrats' electoral fortunes are about to wane significantly, and they might conceivably go through a patch like the Republicans did from the mid-1930s through arguably the early 1970s, at the very least the early to mid-1960s, where they're really out of power for a very long period of time, and therefore are simply trying to do all they can to forestall or block any change that the other party's trying to implement. And then finally, there's the issue of the organization, social scientists sometimes call it organization of interests or interest groups outside the electoral arena. And here the big change that's taken place, I already hinted at part of this over the last generation, is that the main interest groups supporting the left and social policy advance or public insurance advance unions have been steadily weakening, and the groups that tend to support the other side, business interests and the affluent, although there's plenty of division within these groups, and unions themselves are not uniformly in favor of more public insurance or more social policy. So their organization and strength has been going in different directions. Unions have been weakening, and forces favoring the right, favoring lower taxes and less public spending, less generous public insurance programs have been gaining in strength. So then the question is, well, why would anybody reasonably think it's fine and well to, especially as an academic, to say, here we've got these problems, here we've got evidence suggesting a workable solution, but why would anybody think that this is practicable in a country like the United States in 2014? And this really, in some ways, is the core of this book, and the part of it that, to the extent there's been debate and pushback that I've experienced, where it's been centered. I should say both from the left and from the right. Indeed, really more from the left, skeptics or pessimists on the left who just think that it's very unlikely that this is going to happen. So I'll just say a little bit about this and then stop and invite any questions that you might have. I'm very happy to elaborate as much as you'd like me to. First, I want you to step back and take a long-term perspective. So if you look at the United States over the last 100 years, our story with respect to the evolution of public insurance or social policy has been one of slow, episodic, inconsistent advance. So we've gone through these two very important periods where there's been a lot of advance in public insurance. That's the 1930s and the 1960s. And other periods where not much happens, or little bits and pieces are happening, but they're so far behind the scenes and out of the media glare, and indeed outside of political debate, that we often don't know that they're happening. Sometimes there are downward trends, retrenchments, or fallbacks, you might say, weakenings of existing public insurance programs. But the general picture is that almost all the time there are politicians, policymakers, lawmakers who are offering ideas for advances, new public insurance types of programs, new social policies, or expansions in the generosity or scope of existing ones. Most of the time, nothing happens at all. They never make it out of committee in Congress. When they do, they get blocked by the larger body, the House or the Senate. Sometimes they get passed by one, but not passed by the other. In other cases, they actually make it through both bodies, but the president vetoes it. Sometimes they make it all the way through the legislative process and are okayed by the president, and then they're declared unconstitutional or something along those lines in various states or at the national level. And occasionally, things pass all the way through and then they stick. But most of the time, proposals fail. And so we sometimes, especially if you're kind of inclined to favor social policy advance, that is to say, if you tend to be on the left side of the political spectrum, you're very likely to be a pessimist about what's going on and what's possible in our political system. But again, if you take a long time horizon, if you step back and look at the history of the last 100 years, what you see is slow but steady advance that often comes in bursts, and then there are lots of other periods where nothing is happening at all. So, for example, we get periods beginning in the late 1970s, or let's say 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan, where so we had 8 years of Ronald Reagan and then George H.W. Bush. And Reagan was very vocal about arguing that we should shrink the size of government, that a lot of our programs had become too generous. They were sapping the initiative of American workers and entrepreneurs, taxing them too heavily and so on. And yet when we look at the end of the Reagan period, there are not many cutbacks in the generosity of social programs. And in fact, big expansions in Medicaid that almost nobody knew anything about. A little bit of expansion in the earned income tax credit, which was a program that almost nobody knew anything about. It was created back in 1975. It was very much under the radar. Now is far and away our biggest anti-poverty program in the United States, apart from Social Security. Then you get, Bill Clinton gets elected, and there's a lot of enthusiasm about a massive health care reform, and it gets defeated in the end. The Senate doesn't even vote on it. And so hopes for a big advance in reducing the share of Americans without health insurance and reducing the cost for many others, hopes are deflated, and people lose interest. And then there's a big welfare reform that happens in 1996, which is one of the very few instances of genuine retrenchment or reduction in the generosity of our social programs here in the United States. And then you get the Bush period, and then Barack Obama gets elected, the economy falls apart, the Democrats have a very temporary 60-vote filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, and you get the Affordable Care Act, which is by no means a perfect policy. It is not going to solve our problem of lack of affordable health insurance, but really is a big policy advance. It's far and away the biggest change to our healthcare system, legislated change to our healthcare system since Medicare and Medicaid in the mid-1960s. This is essentially the story of the last 100 years. We tend to go through periods where nothing happens, other periods where a big thing happens, and lots of little stuff that occurs behind the scenes. I think of it as a slow but steady ratcheting upwards. And the ratcheting is a key element of this trajectory in the United States. So for all of the difficulty that our political system, with its extensive number of what political scientists refer to as veto points, possibility to block proposed policy change, And that is a real hindrance to advances in public insurance or social policy in our society, in our country. But it also acts as a barrier to or brake on taking away policies that do come into existence. So once a policy gets in, it becomes very, very difficult for opponents to remove it. There are lots of ways that they can do it in the first few years, and we've seen this play out in the last 4 years with the Affordable Care Act. There have been various moments when it was possible that core, very significant parts of this act were either going to be reversed legislatively, although that probably wouldn't have gone anywhere because President Obama would have just vetoed the reversals, or in this case, more likely ruled unconstitutional by the courts. Or possibly, had Obama lost in the last presidential election, and the Republicans had gained a majority in both houses of Congress, they might have legislated some types of reversals, and Mitt Romney would have approved. But in the end, it didn't happen, and now it's very, very unlikely that there are going to be any significant changes to the Affordable Care Act. Moreover, when programs, so most Americans have no idea how policies are going to work when they're at the proposal stage. And a lot of proposals are behind the scenes anyway. They're not, like the earned income tax credit was never even debated by Congress. It was slipped into an appropriations bill in 1975, and nobody really knew about it. Other big proposals, like the Affordable Care Act or Social Security or Medicare, are debated. They're very much in the public eye, but most Americans have no clue about how they're going to work, and therefore no clue what they should think about these things. But once a policy is on the books, once it exists and becomes implemented, if it seems to work, it seems to make people's lives better, and the costs seem relatively affordable, and there don't seem to be many other visible trade-offs, Americans usually grow to like these things, and that acts as an additional brake or barrier to taking them away. So that's why I think of our trajectory as this sort of slow but steady ratcheting upward. Very little happens, and then all of a sudden you get some advance, and so we move a little bit higher. We almost never go back down. Again, the welfare reform of the mid-1990s was a notable exception to that, but in fact it was less an exception than people think, because the generosity of that program, then it was called AFDCA, Families with Dependent Children, and it was renamed TANF, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It had been steadily declining in generosity even before the 1996 welfare reform. And the pace of that decline in generosity really hasn't changed since then. So in some ways it was more a sort of formal shift rather than a substantive one. Now, will this continue? Will the trajectory of the last 80 or, if you want, 100 years maybe, it's really more like 80 years, will it continue? I'm fairly confident that it actually will. Underlying this expansion in public insurance is a fundamental property that we know about human beings, which is that as they get richer, they tend to be more willing to pay for insurance. So think of yourselves or other individuals. When you're young, you're just out of college, you're on the labor market, you probably, if you own a home, you probably have to buy homeowners insurance, otherwise you can't get a mortgage. But you may have gone without health insurance for a while. You probably have to get auto insurance if you buy a car because it's legally mandated. But health insurance and various other types of insurance, if you rented a place, you might have gone without renter's insurance for a few years because you weren't making very much money. Once you get a stable and decent income, you start spending more money on insurance, especially if we think of insurance broadly construed, as in doing things that are going to help your kids' education, for example. We see this very visibly when we look across individuals, when we look at individuals over time, and also when we look at countries. If we compare across the world's countries, we see a very striking relationship between affluence, gross domestic product per person, if you will, and the share of the economy or the share of the country's income that's spent on public insurance. Richer countries spend a lot more. We also see this over time. All of the world's rich countries today, which spend a fair amount of money on public insurance, didn't used to 100 years ago. Slowly but steadily, and at different paces, of course. We've been laggards compared to Sweden and Denmark, for example, or France and Germany. But nonetheless, all of these countries, as they've gotten richer, have slowly but steadily spent more and more on public insurance. Sweden and Denmark may have kind of tapped out they tax and spend about 50 to 55% of their GDP by now. It may be that that's the sort of high point that humans will reach. So what they've done in the last 20 years or so is cut back on spending on certain types of programs that they realized they sort of overextended on or made too generous, and they spent more money on other programs they hadn't really thought about before, but they think now, like early education, for example, public child care and preschool, that they think are really, really, really important. But the general trajectory is upward because of this fundamental property that as we get richer, we're willing to spend more money on insurance. And secondly, as we get richer, we tend to care more about fairness. We become more altruistic. We can see this again over time in all kinds of measures, and a really fascinating example of this. If you haven't read this book, or you can even listen to it on tape, is Steven Pinker's book on the trajectory of violence, which attributes the decline in violence in human communities, human societies over time, in part to this tendency, the fact that as societies get richer, people do become more altruistic. They begin to, there's a lot more to it than that, but this is part of the story. They begin to care more about the well-being of others, apart from themselves and their immediate family. And we can also see this very visibly in public opinion data as we look at that over time within a particular country. So we see in the United States, when we ask questions, when social science or public opinion firms ask questions that tap into various aspects of altruism and generosity, you see that it shrinks during periods when the economy's bad, like 2008 or before that in the early 2000s or the early 1990s, and then it expands again in periods where the economy's doing well. People begin to say, yeah, it's okay if we tax a little more, spend a little more, if we spend more money on the poor to ensure that there's equal opportunity or everybody's got enough food, and on and on and on. We see this very visibly, again, in every country for which we've got good systematic public opinion data over time. There's no reason to think that that's going to change, assuming that our economy recovers. If our economy goes through a very long patch where we have little or no growth, then that very much changes the story. I doubt that that's going to happen. We have had a really bad patch here since 2008, the worst really since the 1930s. And it's not inconceivable that we could go through a period of 10 more years with very, very slow growth. Again, I think that's unlikely, but it's not inconceivable. It's very difficult to predict the future here. And if that happens, if economic growth slows way, way down or stops altogether, we have a stagnant economy for a long period of time, then I think the game changes, or my projection would change. But in the absence of that, assuming we get back to decent economic growth, I don't mean necessarily 1950s, 60s levels of economic growth, but just decent economic growth, I think it's very likely that this long-run pattern will continue to play out. That doesn't really answer the question about all of these particular features of our political system or electoral competition or the strength of organized interest groups, but each one of them has their own story, and so that would take me a very long time to get through it. So instead, I think I'll just stop here. I'll say one more thing, just to put a number on this. In 2007, which is the best point to get a handle on this because deep recessions throw these numbers out of whack, the United States spent about a third of its GDP, about 37%. The government spent about 37% of America's GDP. Not all of it on public insurance or social programs, but that roughly was the size of government at that point in time. Again, Sweden, Denmark, France, the biggest spenders among the world's rich countries are in the neighborhood of 50 to 55%. My best guess is that over the next half century, so more or less extrapolating from what we've seen over the last 80 years, we're probably going to add another 10% of our GDP, so we'll go from about 37% to in the neighborhood of 47% or so, for things like more generous social assistance programs for the poor, a more robust or enhanced earned income tax credit, universal early education, a more generous public pension system for those who don't get a pension through their employer, filling out the expansion of health insurance that began with Medicaid, Medicare, and continued with the Affordable Care Act, the state children's health insurance program, the Affordable Care Act. So getting to near zero Americans without health insurance. Adding a wage insurance program, probably adding a paid parental leave program that's paid for by the government, and a few states are now experimenting with, including California. Probably doing better with our unemployment insurance program. And a few other things. I suspect also we'll add a few more vacation days, government-mandated vacation days. We have the lowest number, the smallest number among rich countries around the world, and that's a real cut to people's living standards, although we don't often think about it in that way. So in these ways and more, my best guess is that we're probably going to tax and spend another 10% of our GDP, getting us closer to the norm of the world's leaders these days. It won't necessarily mean that we're going to see significant improvements in addressing these problems of economic insecurity, inequality of opportunity, and lack of shared prosperity, because my best guess is that the trends in families, communities, and the economy are going to continue to get worse as they have over the last generation. So the challenge for public insurance programs is going to get tougher. But I do think that we'll be in a lot better position to do as well as we can if we do expand these public insurance programs. And I suspect that we will, in fact, despite lots of real, genuine, and formidable obstacles. I suspect that that's exactly what we'll do. So let me stop there.
Here you go. Thank you.
So if you have a question, come forward here.
A central item in your presentation was public and private insurance, and you sort of compare them as if they were similar, just that this is private and this is public. And I think that it's utterly wrong that they are utterly different than each other. In a private insurance, the beneficiaries are those who pay, who purchase the insurance. The ones who don't get anything from that insurance. In the public, it's the other way around. In many cases, the ones who pay don't get benefits. It goes, or get very little. Most of the benefit goes to those who don't pay or pay very little. That means it's really different. And comparing the two as if it's this or that same thing is misleading, at least.
Yeah, thank you. I don't disagree with you at all. That's a very fundamental difference between the two. If I suggested that I think they're similar in that way, I misstated or misled. I think I mentioned private insurance only in the context of telling you that we can observe among individuals that as they get richer, they're more willing to buy insurance, and most of the time the insurance we buy, public insurance comes through tax payments, insurance we buy, we do privately. So all I meant to say is that this is evidence which we can see as we look across people and for individuals over their own lives, that as we get richer, we're willing to spend more money on insurance. You're absolutely right about the very different logics of private and public insurance. And indeed, that's why we need public insurance, because private insurance is innately or necessarily selective. You only get it if you choose to and are able to pay in, whereas public insurance, everyone, or as many as possible, are taxed. And then everyone who's subject to the risk event, whether it's a medical problem or retirement or unemployment or what have you, is eligible for the benefits.
Okay, before I pass on the microphone to the next question, I want to remind everybody here to make it a question, okay? Let's keep, I've got a 2-minute timer here. Let's try to keep the remarks short and have a question at the end. Is that okay?
I certainly hope you're correct in your cautious optimism over the long run. I think one thing that you didn't mention that I'd like you to comment on is that the United States is unique in its public expenditure proportion of military expenditure. Some of that is good because they provide, beside the traditional military functions, but models for public schools and healthcare that we don't think of as traditional military functions. But overall, the programs for weapons of mass destruction being on a permanent war footing, that seems to be so entrenched that I just wonder if you would comment how that figures into your view.
Yeah, I think it offers an opportunity to get some money that can be used for public insurance. So military expenditures are in the neighborhood of 4% of GDP. I can't imagine in the United States 50 years from now, so this is the time horizon I'm thinking about, where we're spending, let's say, less than 2%. Maybe if we do well, we get down to 3%. Now that's nothing to sneeze at, and so when I said I think we're probably going to tax and spend about 10% more of our GDP than we did in 2007. That leaves open a lot of questions about exactly how we could get that money. But reducing military expenditures is certainly one source. I just think it's probably, even in the best case scenario, maybe it gets us 1% additional out of that 10% of GDP, which is nothing to sneeze at, but it's not going to take us all that far.
Okay, I don't know if we have enough time for you to answer this, but I think by 2030 to 2040, we're going to have an entirely new paradigm for this country and actually for the world. I think social democracy is the only way we can go. It's just how it's going to do it. Automation, production and transportation efficiencies, for example, is going to reduce the requirement for how much labor we need. And unemployment, I think, will probably, unless we have a new paradigm to deal with that, we'll have a huge unemployment problem if we don't learn how to spread work differently. And resource scarcity by that time, due to climate change, overpopulation, water and fuel scarcities and so forth, will also play into, there's a lot of people that want to be a libertarian individualist, etc. But I think social democracy is the only way that we can deal with these issues in the long run. Do you have any ideas on what kind of paradigm that we shift to for that?
Yeah, I tend to think less in terms of paradigms than I do in terms of specific institutions and policies which can fit together but don't always do so in a completely coherent way that we might think of as a paradigm. I should just say I use the term social democracy in the title of the book mainly because that's what the political movements and political parties in the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, and again, to some extent Finland, call themselves. And that's the direction that I think we're going to end up going in, but there's nothing sort of sacrosanct about the name social democracy. That's where it comes from. Let me, I think the resource scarcity in the environment's a separate and fundamental and important question that I probably have less of that's new or interesting to say on than lots of other people who are experts. But let me say something about the jobs issue. I do suspect that automation is going to threaten employment increasingly. Take into account that experts have been saying this for a century or more now, and yet the employment rate up until 2008 was increasing actually in most of the world's rich countries anyway. That's to say more and more people, it was accommodating more and more people in jobs. I think that's one possible scenario, but I do think that as the robots and computers get better and better, there's some non-trivial likelihood, and also as we share more of the employment and more of the work with people in less developed countries, which I think is a very, very good thing, there arguably may be fewer jobs for people in rich countries like the United States. So what are people going to do? Well, one scenario is we give everybody a basic income grant, and this is a very prominent sort of left proposal, and just say those who want to work, those who are okay with living on, let's say $15,000, $20,000 a year, and they want to surf or play chess or paint, that's fine. That's one way of dealing with it. I don't think that's a great scenario. Maybe that's where we head at some point in time, but I see that as a recipe for a very divided society. I also think there's a lot of evidence that employment for most people is a very good thing because it helps structure their lives. It's a site of social interaction. So there are a lot of issues here, but then that raises the question, so what are they going to do? My vision is that there are lots of low-end personal services that robots probably won't do all that well. At some point, maybe they will. From just having a conversation with people to changing bedpans to sweeping to cutting grass to managing people's career transitions in the middle of life. Most of us, we have no idea what we want to do at age 22 or age 25, so we take the path of least resistance, and then at age 40 we figure out, I wish I'd chosen something else, which should be possible to change. It's too difficult in today's world. I imagine a whole army of service professionals, counselors, people who can sort of monitor your transitions, help you find a place to go, help you with your marriage. One easy way to think, and also monitor people growing up in low-income and unstable families and dealing with community problems. One way, sort of loosely, to think about this is that throughout the period of affluence, which in the United States is about, let's say, 100, 150 years or so, there have been lots of new things, often physical things, products, but also services that have been created out of thin air that nobody had predicted or knew about before, and originally are only affordable to the rich. But then eventually, as the society gets richer, and also as we get more efficient in producing these things or delivering these services, they become more affordable. And so they trickle down to everybody else. So think about what a typical upper middle class American or affluent American family does these days. They probably have a personal trainer for their kids if they're in sports. Their kids are in extensive music lessons. They travel around the world. They probably get some kind of therapy or counseling on the side, at least one of them. I'm right in the thick of this right now. I have 4 kids age 11 to 17. I'm very much upper middle class. So I see this in my own family and lots of other families that, I'm a college professor, so I know lots of people. These are the kind of things, it's not just the cutting of the grass or the making of the food. Everybody can afford to, almost everybody can afford to go to McDonald's sometimes now. It's all of these other things that eventually can trickle down that we should have large numbers of people doing to make these available to everybody in society. So that's where I see the promise for employment. Now, another question is getting people enough money, because a lot of these are low-end personal service jobs, and we already have a difficult time allowing people to have a decent standard of living when they're working at these jobs. There, I think that's where the public insurance comes in, the earned income tax credit and other types of things. That's a long-winded answer to your question.
Thank you. Hi. I appreciate your presenting the solution to the problem as a public insurance. What I see that mainly as an economic solution, and that's how you framed it. And I personally am framing it more in an ideological frame, where I see there are those in society who who really want deep down an egalitarian society, and there are others who really deep down want to see an individualistic society. And I don't know, I'd like you to, I don't know if you've really addressed that or not, because at some level, just a simple education like, it's a surface solution. But the deep solution is people really believe in either individual, and they think that egalitarian is the wrong way to go.
I have 2 thoughts about this. One is that I do think norms like this shift. We know this from human history. So the norm about violence, for example, or altruism that I mentioned earlier, we can see this. We have data, very limited evidence going back to earlier human societies. But what it suggests is that norms do change. On the other hand, it's a very, very long-term process. We're talking here usually about centuries. And although I have a fairly long time horizon, I'm talking about 50 years or so, I want us to make progress in that period of time. And I don't see a massive shift toward very fundamentally egalitarian sentiments occurring in a half century, maybe even a century or 2. What I do think is that we know that there are public policies that can make people's lives better, and so that's why I focused on that particular issue. Let me make a second point about this too, which is to question the likelihood that we will in fact see humans shifting toward a sort of strong egalitarian norm. And I say this based on some of my observations in thinking about the Nordic countries, again, the ones that I think do best in human history so far, countries like Sweden and Denmark. Even in those societies, although their distribution of earnings and income is less unequal than it is here in the US or the UK or Canada, at the same time, they do have this element of society. Rich people like the Wallenberg family in Sweden, or the IKEA founder, or athletes, or entertainers, who earn a lot of money, sometimes inherit a lot of money, and they have some mild policies that tax them, but they've gone back and forth. Like Sweden had a wealth tax for a while. About 10 years ago, it did away with it. Had no wealth tax at all. Actually, several other European countries have done away with wealth taxes in the last 20 to 25 years. So they're very egalitarian in some respects, but they allow a kind of off the books, out of the conversation, out of the spotlight degree, really substantial degree of inequality that they sort of don't worry about. And so I'm not really sure what to make of this, whether it's just pragmatism or whether it's the fact that ultimately what we really want as human beings is just that everybody does well enough and there's a sufficient degree of equality and a kind of norm of equality. But you know, if there are exceptions, if there's the Bill Gates or the Wallenbergs or the LeBron James or whoever it might be, we're okay with that. It's not too big a deal. So it's sort of a it's a different variant of it's not a super strong egalitarian, or it's not a pure egalitarianism. Put it that way. Anyway, I don't know what to make of it. I just mentioned it as worthy of thought.
One sentence comment and then a question. I wish I could share your optimism about intelligent generosity in our society. Living in Arizona, it's especially difficult. But my question has to do with the concentration of wealth in this country and its increase. Would you say some more about what we can do about this? Because I don't see much happening, or many ways of directing even breaks, much less a change of that.
Just to be clear, do you really mean concentration of wealth, or do you mean concentration of income? Because they're related, but they're two different things.
Income.
Okay, concentration of income, right. So that's the thing that gets the most attention these days. You know, Thomas Piketty, the French economist, has this best-selling book that has given even more attention to it. This, by the way, is stunning to me. A lot of my academic work has been on income distribution in the last 15 or 20 years, and if someone had told me 10 years ago that income inequality would have been at the forefront of policy and public conversation in the United States, I would have laughed and said, yeah, in your dreams. But it is to some extent, and you know, maybe it's fleeting, maybe it'll be gone 6 months or 12 months from now, but it really is surprising and interesting how much attention this has gotten. Now, what can we do? Very, very difficult challenge, as it turns out. So, one important thing to know is that there's sort of two ways you should think about income inequality. One is income inequality, let's say, within the lower 99%. So that's, you know, between the poor, the middle class, and the upper middle class, and the kind of near rich. And the other is the 1% versus that 99% divide. Until about 10 years ago, when Piketty and some of his colleagues began looking at tax records in the U.S. and other countries, we didn't even know really. We had very little information about the 1% versus the 99%. So we have this, you know, the Census Bureau every year spits out an inequality statistic, and academics have a lot of debate, discussion, and research on this. But that was all inequality within the bottom 99%. In the United States, that went up a lot in the 1980s and through the middle of the 1990s, but since then it really hasn't changed very much, according to most of the measures. All of the action in terms of the rise in income inequality in the last 15, almost 20 years now has been between the 1 and the 99. So more and more of the income going to the 1, and you know, again, within the 1, it's the 0.1, and so on. So that's important to know. Because it means that a lot of the traditional solutions, like let's say slowing down globalization or reducing immigration or even enhancing education, probably aren't going to help very much. Those are not really causes for why most of the income growth in the country has been going to this very, very top layer. They're no better educated than someone in the 93rd percentile or even the 75th. They all have college degrees and many have postgraduate degrees. Cutting down on imports has no effect, really, on their income. And immigration, especially of less skilled immigrants, might have some effect on a construction worker with little education, on their likelihood of getting a job and an income. Has no effect, really, at all on the degree of income inequality between the 1 and everybody else. I think probably we have 3 broad strategies. So one is just to increase taxes on the 1%, maybe the 0.1%. I think we should do that, but there's probably a limit to how far that's going to get us, because the effective tax rate on people in the 1% these days, or households in the 1%, is in the neighborhood of 38–40%. We'd have to increase the statutory or on the books tax rates by a lot to get that up a lot higher, or I mean, probably a better solution would be to do away with a lot of the loopholes that allow people to hide money. I actually think we should do this, but I think there's a limit to how far it's going to get us. A second solution is to try to figure out ways so that they get less of the money before taxes kick in. And that actually is really the thing that separates the United States, and to a lesser degree the UK, from a lot of European countries where there's less of a 1%, 99% divide, and it's been increasing less rapidly over there. A lot of that has to do with corporate governance institutions, I think. So partly it's an issue of strength of union, but in a lot of these countries, employees are allowed to elect a certain share of the board of directors in big companies. Never a majority, but almost always either a third or a half, and then the owners get the tie-breaking vote. Part of what that means is that they're a lot less inclined to pay CEOs through the roof. But also it sets a different norm in the society, and arguably a big part of what's changed in the United States is the erosion of a norm of at least rough egalitarianism that existed in the 50s and 60s. It would have been unseemly for big companies to pay their CEOs back in those days the kind of salaries or to give them the stock options that the CEOs get today. But there too, this is only part of the story because there's also the finance industry where people are making money not necessarily because of their salary, but because they're creating new financial instruments that nobody had thought about, or modern communications and computer technology allows them to expand the volume of their trading in ways that we couldn't have anticipated before, which gives their firm a lock on some new investment, like securitized mortgages or something like these, or hedge funds who are using volume and quick transactions to make small amounts of money on certain plays, but they do it in such large volume that they're just making enormous things. And we probably can't do anything by way of corporate governance to try to reduce these salaries. Same is true, arguably, with athletes and entertainers. And then there are lots of lawyers and vice presidents and layers of people underneath these folks who are, whereas a generation ago they might have been making $100,000 bucks. Now they're making 1.5 million because their bosses are making so much that there's lots and lots more to go around. So the big picture here, my big answer is it's a very complicated story and there's no simple solution. Probably if we are going to make a dent, we've got to come at it in a lot of different directions. Simply saying tax the rich more, I think it's right. It's part of the solution, but it's only part of the solution.
You mentioned that income inequality has accelerated since the late 1970s. During the 1980s, supply-side economic policy was implemented very quickly in this country. Do you think the move away from supply-side economic policy would be beneficial, and if so, what policies would you implement?
Well, I think supply side is a term that refers to a variety of things, but at its core was this notion that we were taxing the rich and companies too heavily. And so the idea is that created disincentives for them to expand their businesses, for entrepreneurs to create new businesses, even for people to get educated, because Uncle Sam was taking too much of every extra dollar they earned. And so the idea was the economy, so it would boost the economy, it would stimulate economic growth if we reduced taxation. That would create more savings, more investment, more creation of new businesses. It's not a silly idea. It was perfectly plausible at the time, but we have a lot of evidence now that suggests that it almost certainly was wrong. That is to say that reducing taxes, that doesn't mean that reducing taxes never boost the economy at all. It's just that at that point in time in the United States, it seems in hindsight as though reducing taxes didn't do much to stimulate the economy. We have evidence from our own history, we have evidence from other rich countries as well. I think the most unfortunate part of this so-called supply-side revolution, or the supply-side phase or ideology or approach, is the effect it had on Republican Party political culture in the United States. Because when Ronald Reagan got elected, making this very sort of very vocal and explicit shrink the government argument, and then succeeded in getting two major tax reforms passed, one in 1981 and another in 1986, getting reelected, and then his vice president getting elected after him. You had this 12-year run of Republican Party success, both in policy terms and electoral, which really was very different from what they had experienced ever since the 1930s. And that, I think, set in motion something that very much akin to what happened with Democrats coming out of the 1930s. They had been out of power more or less for a while, and they had this, what they thought was a very glorious period, which ended with victory in World War II. So you see all these new policies come into place that make the society a much fairer place. We win in a war, so the country's safe, and that also has the effect of stimulating the economy. So now we're on a very good economic path in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So Democrats for a generation thought of this, the New Deal period and Franklin Roosevelt, as what identified or defined their party. Modern Republicans think the same way of Ronald Reagan and tax cuts. So they think whatever else Republicans stand for, it's always and everywhere cutting taxes and maybe secondarily doing whatever Reagan said to do. But the tax cut thing is a real problem because the context was very different in 1980. Again, although it turned out to be wrong, I think it was utterly plausible to make the argument that our economy would do better. It really did struggle in the 1970s, actually for very different reasons than levels of taxation. But I think it was plausible to say, cut back on taxes somewhat, we'll stimulate the economy. In today's context, there's just no evidence to support that at all. Other than some microeconomic evidence from surveys and experiments that suggest that people do respond to financial incentives. But that's very different from saying at the level of a modern, rich country at tax and spending levels that we have in 2014 or 2007 or when George W. Bush came into power in 2001, that cutting taxes will stimulate the economy. That's almost certainly wrong. Eventually, I think this will erode, just as Democrats saying, there were lots of Democrats, truthfully, in the 1960s and 1970s who took the position that any kind of cut to any sort of social program was the wrong thing to do. Because whatever else we stand for, it's an expansion of the welfare state, an expansion of, they didn't really call it public insurance, but expansion of the New Deal program. And that's kind of silly as well. I mean, sometimes you do overshoot. Denmark and Sweden and the Netherlands and Germany, to some extent, have made major changes to some of their public insurance programs in the last 20 years. I think sometimes not for the better, but in many instances for the better, because they really did overshoot. We should do the same thing. Eventually, this hardcore orientation will end among Republicans, but it's not going to happen in the next couple of years. It's probably going to take a surprising loss in the presidential election. I think Mondale losing in 1984 is what really set off the Democrats sort of loosening their rigidity. And something like that happening to Republicans, which it will at some point in time. It might be what it takes for that hardcore anti-tax sentiment to ease.
I'd like to go back to Howard's point of military spending. I want to take another run at it, and my question will simply be to ask you to comment on my take on it. Your figure of 4% of GDP is about right, but when you talk about public insurance, you're talking about public money, meaning government collected revenue, that is appropriated for various purposes. And military spending as a percentage of government revenue or government spending is closer to 18%. And I don't know if that factors in things like Homeland Security, which is about roughly $65 billion a year. So, to me, that seems like sort of an elephant in the room in terms of government spending. It just never gets addressed. So I would like to hear your comments on what we can do, if anything, to redirect that public money to better causes.
Well, I am in favor of spending less money on the military, although I may be, my own view might be in favor of smaller cutbacks than some of you here, because I tend to be an internationalist and an interventionist. I generally think, although we've made some foolish decisions in our recent history, our orientation toward the world and our military interventions is now much better than it was for most of our history as a country, and especially for most of the 20th century. And I do think that a more interventionist posture, and I would very much like to see it be much more collective, run through the United Nations or deal with some body that eventually eclipses the United Nations. Because I think intervention is really important and really valuable and saves a lot of people's lives. So, but that's sort of background. I really do think that the bigger picture here, from my perspective, I mean, if you take seriously the notion that doing a lot of good might require as much as 10% more of our GDP in spending, that's a really, really major shift. And even if you're in favor of drastically shrinking our military, I never heard anyone make a plausible argument that says 50 years from now we'll be, we'll more than cut it in half. So we'll go from 4% to, let's say, less than 2%. So I think, let's say we could get another 2% of GDP from military cuts. That would be really significant. That would take us part of the way toward getting that 10% that I think we need for these public insurance programs. But it's only part of the way. That's all I meant to say. I just want to put it in perspective. So very much like I suggested that just increasing taxes on the super rich in the United States is not going to dramatically reduce income inequality. I also think reducing military expenditures is not going to get us nearly to where we ought to want to go over the next half century in terms of expanding public insurance.
Maybe we need to do both.
Yes. Yes, but it's only part of the story. That's all I want to say.
Add something else.
Excuse me. I was listening to NPR this morning, and there was a report that poverty is necessary to fuel a capitalistic society. We have to have poor workers so that we have businesses can make more money, more for the stockholders, etc. And of course now we have these folks that are striking because they're making $7 an hour, $8 an hour, and they're asking for $15 or so. Where do you think this is all going to go? And you haven't mentioned the word capitalism at all in your discussion today. I was just wondering, you use the social democratic terminology.
Yeah.
I'd like your comment on that.
Yeah, so social democratic public insurance within the context of a capitalist economy is my guess. That's where we'll be. It's where Sweden, Denmark, and Norway are these days. It's where we'll be, I think, 50 years from now. One of the things I did mention at the very end is that I think economic pressures that are in the direction of greater insecurity, less equality of opportunity, again, for kids growing up in families with different incomes and educational attainment, not so much race and gender, and lack of shared prosperity. I think these are going to continue and might even worsen. It's been an important part of the story since the 1970s. So modern economies like ours, modern capitalist economies like ours, are now much more competitive in the sense that the typical business faces more competitors, and the intensity of the competition they face is much greater than was the case in the 1950s and 60s when there was very little globalization of the economy. But even in industries that really don't face any foreign competition, let's say like fast food, restaurants, or hotels, there's now much more competition than there was. When my family and I drove along highways on family vacations in the late 60s and early 70s, there was a Holiday Inn and the occasional stop, but that was it. They faced no competition at all. Nowadays, almost every stop, there are 2, 3, 4 hotels. And that's emblematic, I think, of the economic situation that faces firms. But there's much more than that, too. We now have shareholders for publicly owned firms, and here I don't mean publicly as in government, I just mean firms that issue stock shares, which is most large firms, that demand really strong short-term profits in a way that their counterparts in the 50s and 60s didn't. They just cared about some slow appreciation in the stock price and steady dividend payments. That world has completely changed. There's much more pressure on management now to cut any kind of cost. And that means, among other things, making sure if you're McDonald's, you don't pay your bottom line employees more than $7.25 an hour. And that sort of experience and those sorts of pressures are repeated over and over and over again. Unions are much, much weaker now than they used to be. And it's not just that they're less present and less strong in particular firms, but there's no threat effect anymore. In the 50s and 60s, IBM treated its workers, its employees, really well, in part because it didn't want a union. Now, non-union firms don't really have to work, but there's no threat that they're going to unionize. I mean, occasionally there are stirrings of unionization attempts at Walmart, and it takes them very seriously, but I don't think it really thinks that the unions are going to make any major headway. So lots of things are different, and I suspect that that's probably not going to change. That is to say that these types of pressures for wage stagnation, more temporary and part-time and part-year employees, a much more flexible labor force, all of these things are likely to continue and might even get worse. They There might be fewer employment opportunities if there really is a sort of qualitative leap in robots and computers and particular types of occupations, leaving a lot more people out of work. I do think in that respect you can say, and I mean, I worry that sometimes people don't really think clearly about this and just throw the term around, but in that respect I do think we're moving closer to a pure capitalist economy, one that we didn't really have in the 50s and 60s, although we did have a fundamentally capitalist economy. Competition was limited. Unions had an important role, various types of government regulations, many of which still exist, but some, like in the financial industry, have been eroded. So a sort of pure, hyper-competitive capitalist economy that's a more accurate description of our society, or our economy, excuse me, now than it used to be, and I think it's probably going to continue to move in that direction. And that accentuates the need for the type of policies that I hope that we'll enact and expand.
Social democratic is more about people or political thing rather than economy, although economy is part of it perhaps. But there is another factor there, which is how people feel about it. And for quite a few years, there have been polls that were taken year after year after year about how people feel about it in different countries, and consistently Denmark was #1 of happiness. I don't know about Sweden and Finland, but Denmark consistently is there, and there is a message there. It's not always how many dollars you have in your pocket. It's how your life is, or our lives is. And maybe you can comment about it, and maybe we can have some statistics about it.
Yeah. We do this study of happiness or life satisfaction is one area that's really blossoming in the social sciences, and that's in part because we have a lot more data than we used to on this. So there's been a regular survey here in the United States that asks people how happy they were back to started in the early 1970s, and we've got a smattering of occasional surveys before that. Nowadays, almost every rich country regularly asks people how happy they are, how satisfied they are with their life. You know, here in the U.S., the survey asks, are you very happy, pretty happy, or not too happy? In a lot of the countries, they're asked to score their happiness or life satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10 or something like that. Now to your question. So it is true that Denmark almost always is top in the life satisfaction rankings. And there have been a couple social scientists who recently have published op-eds and in two cases books arguing that there is a systematic relationship between the size of the welfare state, the public safety net, or more broadly the fairness of the society and happiness. And they sort of, so the Denmark scoring at the top is the entry point. You know, it's the anecdote that stimulates you to think, hey, I mean, if Danes are a lot happier than Americans, and look how crappy the weather is, and so, you know, only half the country has terrible weather here. They must be doing something right. So I've actually looked pretty carefully at these data a bit. You know, I would have very much embraced the conclusion that says social democracy or a big public safety net leads systematically to happier people and people who are more satisfied with their lives. But I actually don't see the correlation if we look across the countries. Yes, Denmark is in top. But Australia, New Zealand, and Canada almost always rank right up there. They have much smaller public safety nets. They're a little bit bigger than ours here in the United States.
Healthcare.
Healthcare is important, but every other rich country in the world besides us provides healthcare, good healthcare to all their citizens. So it's hard to really differentiate based on health. It might be a reason why we're lower than we should be according to our GDP per capita. So one of the things that does correlate with happiness or life satisfaction is just overall affluence, the gross domestic product per capita. And if you plot the two, we score below where our GDP per capita would predict that we ought to be, which is right behind Norway. So Norway is the highest per capita GDP. So, lack of health care, maybe a small public safety net or something like that might help explain it. You know, could be too that we have a really high murder rate, for all I know. the United States is idiosyncratic and exceptional in lots and lots of respects. And I guess all I want to say is that although I haven't done this haven't looked at this as extensively or carefully as I have some other things, I'm not really persuaded that there's a link between the scope and generosity of public insurance programs and life satisfaction or happiness. Denmark's position notwithstanding. But I could be wrong.
Those of us who want to have lunch, we can socialize a little there, discuss some more what took place, and we can join us for lunch.